I'm not going to be talking about the class warfare point of view and the class warfare themes because those are already rampant online.
See him that way, feel like I need a nightlight. I ask you for the neck, well, I need pass out like your biceps.
I think Us is about the shadow work we need to do as individuals and as a country if we actually want to heal. One of the best ways to start your healing journey is to be honest with yourself, to be honest with any kind of anger that you hold and why you hold that anger, to look at yourself in the mirror, to be creative, because you come to know yourself by seeing yourself. I don't think it's a coincidence that Addie started dancing when she saw her shadow. Addie needed a way of expressing herself, and Addie seeing herself allowed her to express herself. It's really hard for me to ignore the spiritual and religious symbols in this movie, which is why my interpretation is so heavily based in spirituality, shadow work, and family dynamics, especially how this lack of spiritual growth affects family dynamics in America. I also wrote an article on Us on Medium if you guys want to check this out. I really like the point that I make in this paragraph. There is a great amount of symbolism in the fact that every member in the family kills their own shadow. You need to be able to battle your own shadow before you can battle someone else's. You need to help yourself before you can help others. Us opens on Addie's birthday when she's a child, and her dad wins her a prize. The booth man says that she can choose from the second row, or she can keep going and keep playing and win a stuffed animal on the third row. Addie is unsure if she wants to stop or keep playing, and she decides to stop, asking for the Michael Jackson Thriller t-shirt number 11. This is significant because Michael Jackson at this time was topping the charts as the world's king of pop. He was one of the world's first big black pop stars, and I'm sure that Addie found that comforting. Though the Thriller music video scared her, she still found Michael Jackson's Thriller shirt to be more comforting than a teddy bear, which shows that she's a smart kid, and she's also a really strong kid. She was scared by something, but she still found comfort in it. Seeing somebody who looked like her in a position of power and admiration was really comforting to her, more comforting than a teddy bear. She was scared by something, but she still found comfort in it because there was a kind of empowering quality, and things can be scary and empowering at the same time. Addie and her parents keep walking, and her parents start arguing about how maybe she shouldn't have gotten the Thriller t-shirt because the music video scared her when she first saw it. Cut to a girl flaunting a stuffed animal at her friend. Addie might be wondering if she made the wrong choice. Maybe she should have gotten the comfort. Maybe she should have gotten the stuffed animal. Her dad then mentions that she should go on the Big Dipper, which is a roller coaster. This is a really interesting metaphor to me because the Big Dipper is a star constellation. Shoot for the stars. Her dad, in a way, is encouraging her to shoot for the stars. But her mom says, what if it scares her? Maybe she shouldn't go on this big girl ride because big girl rides are scary for a little kid. The family then walks over to play whack-a-mole, and the dad, especially being the one to choose whack-a-mole, may symbolize that he's trying to push something down, the same way that he's drinking in this scene to suppress emotions. He wants to push everything down instead of addressing it directly. And in the theme of shadow work, what you're not supposed to do is push everything down under the surface. In our culture, however, that is what we are taught to do to deal with our problems. Addie is around 7 or 8 years old, I want to say, in her flashbacks. And as she's walking past the Jeremiah 11:11 dude and walking past this couple playing a game of chance, I'm sure she has a lot of questions. Age 7 or 8 is the age kids tend to ask a lot of questions. They mainly ask a lot of why questions. Why is the sky blue? Why is mommy like this? Why is daddy like this? Addie walking past a religious man and walking past a couple playing a game of chance, I'm taking that as a symbol to mean that Addie is questioning whether things are up to fate or if things are up to chance. Jeremiah 11:11 is a Bible passage that talks about worshiping false idols and how God won't save you if you worship these false idols. We do worship money and we do worship wealth. Addie descends a flight of stairs that take her away from the bright lights of a carnival and bring her into the shadows. I see this as a metaphor for the unconscious. She is entering the shadow realm, the realm of the suppressed thoughts. She approaches the water on the beach. Water is another metaphor for the unconscious. Addie turns away from the water to enter a building labeled Vision Quest, Find Yourself. Addie is about to enter her unconscious mind. She's about to go on a quest. She's about to find herself. Doing this kind of internal work is what shadow work is all about. Addie drops her candied apple, which she was carrying up until now, which may be a metaphor for how by going into the vision quest to find herself, she is willing to drop the sugar. She is willing to drop the sugar coating that she has been holding until now. She wants truth. She doesn't want something false and sweet and easy. She wants something fulfilling. This reminds me of her choosing the Thriller shirt over the stuffed animal. In the Vision Quest, she's walking through some kind of fake forest and an owl pops out at her. In a lot of cultures around the world, the owl is a symbol of wisdom. She's becoming wiser by walking into this unconscious part of her. She's about to gain some wisdom. She's about to see more parts of herself, literally. She's walking through the forest. A narrator comes in the intercom in the speakers, and the narrator says, in this world there is no joyful movement, and then it cuts out. I'm pretty sure that he was about to say something else, but then Jordan Peele intentionally cut it off at the phrase, in the world there is no joyful movement. This part really caught my attention the last time I watched it, because later in the film, Addie becomes a dancer. Addie was specifically a ballerina. A very strict style of dance. Maybe it's a class thing because she was born into an upper middle class family. So she feels like she has to be in a more controlled form of dance because she's in a more controlled environment. There's not a lot of free form in ballet. Everything is exact. It's beautiful, but it is a more controlling dance form than most. In the world, there is no joyful movement. It makes me wonder if Addie actually enjoyed dancing or if she did it to please her parents and her psychologist, because adult Addie doesn't dance at all in the movie. We don't see her dancing with her husband in the kitchen. We don't see her dancing in the living room, dancing in the car even. Is it because the pressures of ballet encourage preciseness? Is she scared to dance outside of this preciseness? Red was mad at Addie because Addie stopped dancing. I don't think that Red would have cared about the precision of Addie's dance moves. I think Red just wanted to be acknowledged through dance. It didn't have to be precise. That idea that she had to be perfect was likely put into Addie's head by her society or her dance instructor or both. As the narrator says, there is no joyful movement. All the lights in the building go out, which highlights the exit signs. Exit signs seem to be in a million different places. There are a million different exits. There are a million different ways out. I took this to mean that there are a million different paths Addie could have taken. She could have turned around, but she didn't. She wanted to keep going. In a way, I think that she wanted to see her shadow self, and she wanted to take this path. This part brings me back to Jeremiah 11:11, specifically the number 11:11. 11:11, make a wish. I think Addie is wishing for truth. Addie is wishing for honesty. Addie wanted to get to know herself, which is why she entered the vision quest to find herself. She keeps walking down the hall of mirrors and sees that one reflection is not like the others. We see Addie look scared of her shadow self. Cut to the titles, and the image on the screen is a bunch of rabbits in cages. Rabbits typically symbolize fertility and springtime and rebirth. All these rabbits in cages, to me, symbolize all the people who haven't gotten to know themselves, all the people who have blocked their spiritual rebirths.
Oh, I don't want to. I want to stay down here.
We then cut to Addie being all grown up. She's married and she has kids, and her family are on their way to their vacation home. The family gets out of the car and sits down at their lake house dinner table. We find out that Addie's daughter, Zora, runs track, but she's thinking about quitting. We also learn that the son, Jason, is into magic. What really grabbed my attention about this dinner table scene was when Jason says, when you point a finger at someone else, you have 3 pointing back at you. And everyone at the table is confused. I was confused about this part too. I didn't catch this part the first couple of times that I watched this movie, but in my 4th viewing, I actually ended up looking up this phrase as I was watching the movie. And apparently, when you point a finger at someone else, you have 3 pointing back at you is a common phrase in some circles. The phrase basically means if something about somebody else is bothering you, that thing is bothering you about yourself. So it's a phrase that has to do with self-reflection. And I don't know where Jason would have heard that as a 7-year-old, that when we have an issue with ourselves, we tend to take it out on other people, which is very common, unfortunately. The next scene of significance, in my opinion, is when Zora is in the bathroom looking at herself in the mirror, and Jason pops out from his hiding place to scare his sister. This scene is so subtle, but it makes so much sense to me given the age that Zora is. She's 14. That's around the age most kids really start self-reflecting and looking at themselves in the mirror, both literally and figuratively. A lot of the time, looking at yourself in the mirror like that, doing that kind of inner work can be very scary, which is why a lot of teenagers get depressed as they learn how to deal with themselves and deal with their inner monsters. Jason popping up behind Zora as she's looking in the mirror could represent how a lot of teenagers feel like they're little monsters, when, by the way, you're not. You might have a monster within you, but you are not a monster. You know what I mean? Not pretty enough, not smart enough, not strong enough, have bad skin, etc., whatever it is. Which reminds me of how Zora was talking about quitting track because she didn't think that she was good enough to get into the Olympics, even though her father believed in her. We then see Addie looking at a picture of herself from back when she was a child and a dancer. She looks up when she hears a noise coming from the lake and sees Gabe pulling up in a boat. He's on the water. And again, water is a symbol for the unconscious, symbolizing that Gabe is playing in his subconscious. It might also be representative of how consumerism and showing one's class is integrated into Gabe's subconscious. After Gabe has had his fun on the water in his new boat, and it cuts to the family driving in the car heading to the beach. The first person who speaks is Zora. She says, "Did you know there's fluoride in the water the government is using to control our minds?" And the timing of the statement is perfect. This could be an extension of the previous scene. The father was having fun on the water. Zora is bringing up her concerns and her fears about the water, fears of the unconscious, fears that other people could be controlling your unconscious. You could take Zora's statement to mean literally the government is poisoning the water to control our minds, or you could interpret it to mean the government is controlling our unconscious with advertising and consumerism and this keeping up with the Joneses mentality that Gabe clearly has in this movie. And remember, I said that this movie has themes of how family dynamics could alter how you approach your shadow work. It's also worth noting that later in the film, when Zora is in the driver's seat, literally, she is the one driving the car, everyone encourages her to back up, especially Gabe encourages her to back up and get away from her shadow. Back up, away from your shadow. But Zora ignores this and hits drive and goes straight for her shadow. She wants to do this shadow work. It's everyone else that's telling her to run away from herself. Teenage girls always seem to be in a rush to grow up, which highlights my point about how Zora is being pushed to run. Teenage girls are being pushed to run away from their baby selves. In contrast, Jason wearing a Jaws t-shirt and digging a tunnel in the sand shows he doesn't want to run. He wants to dig and do magic, and he's fascinated by monsters and these scary sharks and stuff. The Jaws shirt may also be foreshadowing danger, since he wears this shirt before he sees the same Vision Quest Find Yourself building that Addie entered as a child. However, it is now labeled Merlin's Forest, not Vision Quest. This renaming of the building is really interesting to me because it shows how spirituality and the view of spirituality has changed in our culture. I also wanted to bring up the racial and political implications of this name change because it is partly a sign of the times. They didn't want to be seen as a company that took part in cultural appropriation, so I'm sure that's a part of the reason for the name change. But I also have to wonder if they changed the name to Merlin's Forest because they wanted to use a white mystic. And there has been this really interesting divide between magic and spirituality, especially in modern Western culture. When we think of an Indian or a Native American man, we think of a type of spirituality. Whereas with Merlin, we think about magic, but we don't think about spirituality as much. In modern Western culture, a lot of people think of magic as entertainment instead of spirituality and a spiritual practice. In old world indigenous cultures around the world, all races of indigenous cultures, magic and spirituality are linked. People have separated magic from spirituality and made magic a form of entertainment instead of being linked to spirituality. It's a way of commercializing and making the word associated with entertainment instead of growth and inner work. So that's a really interesting commentary there. Gabe makes a solid joke about how I Got Five on It is a dope song and not about drugs, because dope. It's a dope song. It's not about drugs, but it's a dope song. I thought it was funny. Addie encourages Jason to snap in rhythm with the song. This part reminded me of the concept of being in rhythm with yourself. If you haven't heard about this concept, look up Alan Watts, Carl Jung, or Clarissa Pinkola Estes. This scene is also funny because Addie is a bit off rhythm and encourages Jason to follow her rhythm instead of finding his own rhythm in the song. That's a whole commentary on how parenting works in the United States. Parents usually pressure their kids to follow in their footsteps. They usually try to push their kids into a certain path instead of letting kids find their own paths, instead of letting kids find their own rhythms.
It'll keep you safe.
Understanding your internal rhythms is part of facing your shadow. As Jason walks by Merlin's Forest, he sees the shadow double of the dude that we saw in the ambulance earlier, only he's not holding the Jeremiah 11:11 sign. Jason seeing this shadow double on the beach with his bloody hand could also symbolize how Jason was traumatized by seeing his first dead body, because the shadow double isn't holding the Jeremiah 11:11 sign. Jason didn't wish to see this man. It seems like Addie and Jason were both traumatized around the same age, which is really interesting. I have to wonder if Addie is triggered by Jason throughout the movie, because Jason seems to remind Addie of what happened to her when she was Jason's age, around 7 or 8. But I'll get back to this later in the video. This does come up again. The pun of spirits is apparent throughout the movie. Spiritual spirits, but also alcoholic spirits. It's especially obvious when the Wilsons meet up with the Tylers. Mr. Tyler is wearing a shirt that says fragile on it and has a picture of some kind of wine glass on it, which might be a reference to white fragility and how white people conquered America partially by introducing false spirits. Part of the reason why white people conquered America is because they gave the natives alcohol, these false spirits, these false idols. Introducing them to this alcohol, introducing them to this type of spirit made them weaker instead of stronger. Spirituality is usually about making yourself stronger, whereas alcohol, this false spirit, typically makes you weaker. By the way, I'm not telling anybody what to do. I still drink, but that's just the symbolic interpretation. A lot of spiritual texts make a point of saying that when you know yourself and you build your individual self, your spirit is stronger. Meanwhile, the Tyler's version of spirit is drinking alcohol. There is a lack of strength and a lack of individuality in the Tyler family, which is highlighted when we find out that the daughters are twins. This lack of inner strength and lack of individuality is also seen in the mother, Kitty, who seems to have serious self-esteem issues, bringing up some pretty interesting points about white women's insecurities versus black women's insecurities. It reminds me of that scene in Orange is the New Black where I think it was Tasty said, "There are a million ways for a black woman to be beautiful. For white women, you just have to be skinny." Young and skinny is typically the beauty standard for white women, whereas with black women, there is a different beauty standard. I'm actually currently working on a video essay about the link between whiteness and thinness, because there is a lot there. There is a history on why white women specifically tend to value thinness. But back to us. I think it makes a lot of sense that Jason would be the first one to see the Shadow family. This could be a part of his personality, or it could just be the age that he is. My first thought when I saw the Shadow family on screen was that they looked like escaped prisoners in their jumpsuits. It reminds me of the rabbit scene from the title sequence. It's like this rebirth is being trapped. This rebirth is being imprisoned. Spiritual growth, the rebirth is being imprisoned. Well, now the shadows have escaped from their prison and the rebirth is happening. Likely because both Addie and Jason were wishing on an unconscious level to see their shadow selves. This 11:11, I want to see my shadow self. I want to see truth. I don't want to see false idols anymore. Jason is a lot more like Addie than Zora is. And this is further highlighted later in the movie when Red makes a point of saying her daughter was a normal birth, but her son was cut out of her. It made me think of the phrase cut from the same cloth. They both have this kind of need to see these spirits, to see these shadows. This might be why Addie is triggered by her son, but not her daughter. The shadows approach when Gabe says, "We can get crazy. You want to get crazy? We can get crazy." How people tend to feel a little bit crazy when they first start their shadow work. It's literally a different reality than he's used to, so he might feel a little crazy at first. The shadow selves are all carrying scissors, and the scissors are super interesting to me because they remind me of the three fates from Greek mythology. These scissors in Greek mythology were used to cut a mortal's life, tying into the theme of rebirth I mentioned with the rabbits. The mother, Red, seems to be the leader of the Shadow family, while Gabe seems to be the leader of the Wilsons. This reminds me of the idea that feminine energy is typically internal, while masculine energy is typically external. Feminine energy is the realm of emotions, while masculine energy is the physical realm. Anyway, they discover that the Shadow family looks just like them. The Shadow family then gets into the Wilsons' home, and the Shadow mother, Red, speaks, and it sounds like she's struggling to talk. She tells a story about how once upon a time there was a girl, and the girl had a shadow. The two were connected. The above girl ate and her food was warm and tasty. The below self ate and she ate bloody rabbit that was cold. Lots of contrast, blah, 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 blah. Red is the only shadow who speaks. A recurring theme here is the power of the voice, the power of speech, the power of being heard. Because Red is heard and seen the most, she is the most powerful. So it's really interesting that the Shadow family and the Shadow people in this movie can't talk. It's also really interesting that Jason's shadow self, Pluto, his mouth is burned. While Addie married a handsome prince, Red was forced to marry the prince's shadow. This part is really interesting to me because we tend to choose partners when we see them in the physical realm, but it's really important to make sure that your shadow and your partner's shadow are also a match, because you're going to be with this person for a very, very long time, hopefully, right? So you want to make sure that not only are your physical selves compatible, not only are your worldly selves compatible, but are your spiritual selves compatible? Are your shadow selves compatible? And this was a very good point that Red made. Maybe Abraham and Red had some issues. Maybe Abraham didn't talk as much as Red did. And maybe Red wanted to talk to Abraham more. Maybe there are some unconscious issues, some shadow issues that Addie and her husband Gabe have, which is very common in a marriage. Red goes on to talk about how she birthed her first child, Umbre. She says that while Addie had a beautiful baby girl, the shadow, Red, gave birth to a little monster, which seems to be preying on Zora's fears that she may be a monster. And let's be honest, all kids and all teenagers are kind of monsters. All people in general are kind of monsters in their own way. Red also makes a point of saying that Umbre, Zora's shadow, was born laughing, but then she turned into a monster, which highlights my point even further. Zora's shadow, Umbre, was born laughing. She was this happy kid until she became a monster, likely when she was in her teenage years. Her second child, Pluto, Jason's shadow, was cut out of her, like I mentioned earlier. Something I tried to understand more about this part is why Zora and Jason are so different. And the conclusion I came to is that Zora is an older sister. Jason is the baby. Addie was an only child. So Addie might relate more to Jason than to Zora because Addie never had to be a big sister. Thinking about the age gap between Zora and Jason, it's likely that Zora was around Jason's age when she became Jason's big sister. So I don't think she had the luxury of diving into her imagination and diving into her creativity as much as Jason was allowed to, because Zora was probably told to be this mature big sister, while Jason was allowed to be this baby in imagination land at that age. I think that's another reason why Zora is said to be born laughing, but becomes a monster in her later years. It's that whole older sibling syndrome. I'm not the baby anymore. Why can't I play imagination? She might have been jealous or even hated Jason for taking her parents' attention away from her. She was told to mature at a younger age while Jason was allowed to play. Red goes on to say that the shadow hated the girl so much for so long until one day the shadow realized she was being tested by God. Let's break that down. Adelaide's shadow repeatedly mentions being tested by God all on her own. The shadow acknowledges the test, while Adelaide never mentions God's name. This could imply that shadows are divine beings, similar to how each individual has a piece of God or divinity within them, and how this divinity is brought to the surface when we discover our passions. Let's also go back to the point that Red made about the contrast in food and in toys. The difference in food quality between Addie and Red. In many spiritual traditions around the world, food and drink and objects of value, including toys, are offered to the spirit realm as a sign of respect. The girl, Addie, wasn't sharing her food or drink with her. Red might have seen this as a sign of disrespect, that Addie wasn't offering her food and drink, and she might have expected that as a spirit. I got really interested in what these names mean. A lot of these names are biblical names. So I wanted to look up what these names actually mean in the context of the film. Addie's full name is Adelaide, and Adelaide is a French Christian name that means noble or kind. In contrast, her shadow's name is Red, and red typically symbolizes anger. This could mean that Adelaide swallows a lot of anger, and she doesn't want to show this anger to the world. She wants to show a noble face, a kind face to the world, which is why all of this anger gets bottled up and channeled into Red, into her shadow. Addie's anger comes out throughout the film. Every single time she kills a shadow, her anger is shown to the audience more and more. Gabe is Addie's husband. Gabe is short for Gabriel, and Gabriel in the Bible was the archangel who announced to the Virgin Mary that she would be carrying God's child. Abraham is Gabe's shadow, and Abraham in the Bible is from the book of Genesis, the Old Testament. He's revered by Jews, Christians, and Muslims because he's one of the first prophets in monotheism. Both of these characters are messengers. Gabriel is announcing the birth of the Son of God, whereas Abraham is announcing that his children will take over a new nation. The shadows did take over a new nation. All of the people's above selves, except for the Wilson family in this film, seem to have been killed. So in this sense, Abraham's children did take over a new nation. Remember what I said about both Gabriel and Abraham being messengers? Well, Gabriel was the original messenger because he was the original one in the story. He's also the one who originally wears the glasses, who has the original vision. But Abraham takes Gabe's glasses and puts them on his own face. The vision has changed. Gabriel's vision isn't relevant anymore. Now it's Abraham's vision. Gabriel isn't predicting the birth of the Son of God anymore. Instead, Abraham's chosen people have arrived. The Son of God isn't in somebody's belly anymore. The spirit, the shadow is here. There's also another layer to Abraham taking Gabe's glasses, and I think it's because Abraham changes Gabe's point of view. Gabe sees himself as the family's protector. He's the patriarch in the family, the father in the family. And when Gabe is first introduced to the Shadow family, he tries to protect his family, but he can't. Gabe at first tried to threaten the Shadow family, but that didn't work. Then Gabe tried offering money to protect his family, and that didn't work. So when Abraham snatched Gabe's glasses, he literally changed Gabe's point of view. And he made Gabe realize he is no longer the protector of his family, that each of his children and his wife, they all have to battle their own shadow selves. He might be able to protect them in the physical realm, but in the shadow realm, in the spirit realm, Gabe can't help them. Zora's name was a little bit trickier to find. I got two meanings when I looked up the name Zora. One source said Zora means dawn, while another source said that Zora means a scab, leprosy, or a hornet. There is a point of view that I could articulate right now, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm not going to get into that, and we'll just say that Zora means dawn. I never heard the name Umbre before, and I had to look into it more in depth to understand it and to find the meaning of this name. I found this Latin proverb, lux umbrae Dei, which means light is the shadow of God. So I'm guessing that Zora is the dawn, the first look of light, while Umbre is the shadow. I also found out that Lux Umbrae Dei is a prayer for people who are in purgatory. This further complicates Zora's relationship with her shadow. On one hand, Zora wants to please the people around her, but on the other hand, she wants to establish her identity as a teenager. This puts Zora in purgatory. She is in the middle. She wants to please people, but she also wants to express her individuality. She's in the middle. Umbre chasing her and running towards her may represent how Zora's individuality and her spirit are trying to catch up with her as she runs away from them. Jason and Pluto's names were the most obvious to me because Jason in the Bible is a healer, while Pluto is another name for Hades, god of the underworld. This contrast makes a lot of sense in the context of this movie. This movie is about shadow work and rebirth. Healers in indigenous cultures are often the ones responsible for guiding others through their shadow work, guiding them through the underworld. In this way, Jason is a healer, guiding his family through their shadow work. His age-triggering Addie guides her through her shadow work. And he is the only one in the movie who seems to be in touch with and can play with his shadow self without getting hurt. You thought I was done? You thought I was done? It's not just the Wilsons' names that are meaningful. The White family, the Tyler's names, also have interesting meanings behind them. I'm not sure if Kitty is short for Kathleen or Catherine. Kitty, as her name, could mean that she is like a house cat to her husband, a pet to make the house feel warm and look cute, which could mean that she feels disrespected and unequal in their marriage. Kitty feeling like a house cat, like she has to be warm and look cute, it could be one of the reasons why she is insecure. Kathleen and Catherine also make sense though, because Kathleen and Catherine both mean clean and pure, which could symbolize how society typically views white women, at least until they get older. In the Bible, Catherine is a martyr who dies for her faith, and the main takeaway of Catherine's story is to stay strong in your faith and what you believe. This is a very chilling parallel to Kitty, in my opinion, because Kitty was so delusional when her family got attacked. She continued to crawl towards her dead husband instead of trying to crawl out the door. She was strong in her faith that everything was okay when it actually wasn't. This also seems like a commentary on how white women will often cling to their proximity to power instead of developing their own internal power, but more on that later. I will also get into Kitty's shadow self, Dahlia, in a little bit. Josh is the white father. Joshua in the Bible's biggest mistake is that he fails to consult God before going into battle. Joshua's biggest lesson from God is to be willing to fight for his life. Similarly, Josh in Us doesn't see his shadow self coming, and he is drinking alcohol right before the shadow family attacks. He consulted an alcoholic spirit, a false spirit, the delusion that things are more peaceful than they actually are. He didn't listen to his wife or his children when they expressed concern. He didn't consult anybody else. He was just like, oh yeah, everything's cool, don't worry about it. Play good vibrations. He also wasn't willing to fight. The main takeaway from Joshua in the Bible is that you should fight. Josh wasn't willing to fight. He didn't even want to leave the house. Kitty and Josh's shadow selves are named Dahlia and Tex. This seems to be a reference to the real-life Black Dahlia murders. One of the murder victims, a woman, was found with the word Tex written on her stomach in lipstick. Since Tex was written on the murder victim's stomach, and Kitty is often seen being irritated by her husband, I have to wonder if she sees her husband as a child she is carrying, or if her marriage makes her stomach feel queasy. Her husband wore a fragile shirt when we first meet his character, so he must be a weak-minded person, which must irritate her. Okay, and now that I've explained the names, let's get back to the summary. When Gabe asks the Shadow Mother Red, "What are you people?" she says, "We're Americans." You could also interpret this to mean that our shadows are also Americans, because our shadows are a part of us. It reminds me of this Carl Jung quote that goes something along the lines of, if you don't incorporate your shadow into yourself, your shadow will only grow stronger. Red saying, "We're Americans," also reminded me of a quote by Clarissa Pinkola Estes in Women Who Run with Wolves. She roughly says, the more a culture values individuality, the less likely there is to be a slave class, because those values don't mix. If you value liberty and individual expression as a culture, that doesn't allow room for a slave class. Encouraging individuality means encouraging everyone's individuality and acknowledging everyone's individual needs within that society. This kind of society wouldn't have a slave class and wouldn't allow a slave class to exist. Thinking about it in this way pokes holes in American values. We think that we value individuality, but we really don't. We think that we encourage liberty and individual expression, but we really don't. There is a kind of strength and spirituality in developing your individuality. And that strength and individuality, a lot of the time, comes from doing shadow work and getting to know yourself. But American society purposely doesn't want us to do that. Instead, American society encourages us to buy our spirituality, to buy our spirits. We buy our self-worth. We don't build our self-worth. We've been brainwashed under capitalism to substitute consumerism for spirituality. But back to the story again. Abraham is the first shadow to attack. Again, his role is to send a message. So it would make sense that Abraham would be the first one to attack. Umbre is next. Red tells Zora to run. Remember my point that I made earlier about how everyone is telling Zora to run. Addie tells Jason to not be afraid and to show Pluto one of his tricks. They go to a closet to go play together. And honestly, Jason playing in a closet makes sense to me. He probably feels safer playing where nobody else can see him work his magic. He wants to develop his individuality away from prying eyes. He doesn't want anybody's input in how he develops his magic. This might also be why he always uses his toy ambulance as a doorstop. It's important to him that he plays. It's an emergency to him that he plays. He wants to keep his magic and his individuality alive. Since it is repeatedly stated that Pluto loves fire, I do have to wonder if Pluto burned his own mouth. Maybe he burned himself because his fire got out of control. He could have metaphorically burned himself because he expressed himself too much in the past. And so he intentionally or accidentally silenced himself. It is also worth noting that Jason's magic trick only works when he plays with Pluto. To put it another way, Jason's magic only starts to work when he sees his shadow self and includes his shadow self in his games. Cut back to the living room. Red says she and the other shadows want to take their time. They've been waiting for this day for so long. I have to wonder if this is a reference to capitalism and the hustle culture and the grind culture that we have that is so fast-paced that it makes it difficult to take the time to do introspection. You come to know your spirit when you slow down a little bit and you listen to it. The spirit needs space to speak, or else it will demand space to speak, which is why people shut down from depression or from burnout. Their spirit is demanding space to speak. The scene cuts to the boat. Gabe is the first one to kill his shadow self. He kills Abraham on his boat on the lake, and the family escapes on Gabe's boat. This part is so beautiful to me because, in a way, Gabe took his glasses back. Gabe took his point of view back from Abraham. Gabe is again the protector of his family. Gabe saved his family by battling with himself and winning. By actually facing his shadow, he became the protector that he always wanted to be. The scene then cuts to the Tyler family's lake home. The Tyler's house has a system named Ophelia, which is very similar to Alexa. The most popular Ophelia in literature is Ophelia from the play Hamlet by William Shakespeare. In Hamlet, Ophelia is an obedient daughter, which explains the Alexa comparison. Ophelia is also noted by another character to be incapable of handling her own distress. Josh putting on Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys instead of listening to his wife and daughters, but especially the alcohol that seems to be always present when the Tyler family is around, show that the Tyler family doesn't seem to be willing or able to face their shadow selves, which is why the entire family gets killed in like 2 seconds. Their shadows snuck up on them because they were only focusing on the good vibrations. The twin girls are the first to go down, and then the dad. The mom lasts a little bit longer. Kitty is seriously injured, but she crawls towards her dead husband's body. Her husband's shadow stands over her and pretends to help her up, but then takes his hand away with a malicious grin, which only highlights the fact that Kitty feels unsupported by her husband, how he pretends to help her, but doesn't actually help her. Kitty says, "Please stop," to the husband's shadow, and Ophelia thinks she's talking to her, so Good Vibrations stops playing. Finally, Kitty snaps into the reality of the situation that she is in. In other words, the good vibrations have stopped. Kitty tells Ophelia to call the police, but Ophelia misinterprets and starts playing Fuck the Police by NWA, which is hilarious. Kitty's shadow slits her throat. The Winstons then show up at the Tyler family's house looking for help and soon realize the family that greets them at the door is not their friends. They take Addie into the house and Josh's shadow goes head to head with Gabe. The way I interpret this part is that, generally speaking, Black people tend to fight both their own shadows and white people's shadows. Since white people are more likely to align with America's white imperialistic ideals, white people tend to be less aware of how American society and values can be detrimental to spiritual health. And because they are less aware of their spiritual health, their shadow is more likely to be stronger than their spirit. This can lead to white people's shadows lashing out at both their own spirit and at other spirits. The way that the Tyler family's shadows killed them off first before attacking the Wilsons. The Tyler family's lack of self-awareness didn't just put them in danger, it also put their friends in danger. The Wilsons seem to have a kind of self-awareness that the Tyler family lacks, which is why the Wilsons saw their shadows coming. The Tyler family was blindsided by their shadows. In modern-day America, unfortunately, a lot of indigenous healing practices are demonized. which goes back to the history of how America was founded. If you think about it, America became heavily populated during the height of the witch trials in Europe. This ideology that we should kill off our spiritual healers and kill off powerful women became deeply ingrained into Americans' ethos. White cultures did and still do have their own indigenous spiritual practices, but they were heavily wiped out by the witch trials. The people who were trying to wipe out the spiritual healers in their communities were often people seeking power. So what they did was prioritize war and political power over spiritual innovation. This means a lot of, especially white Americans, tend to lack a kind of self-awareness. They tend to lack a kind of spiritual growth, which is why I will continue to say that white imperialism isn't good for white people either. But again, I digress. We then hear screams, and Gabe is fighting Tex in Josh's boat on the lake. It seems like Gabe wins. Again, Gabe is fighting a masculine shadow on a boat, on the water, battling his subconscious, or battling somebody else's subconscious that was pushed onto him. Dahlia hears the screams and walks over to the window. She starts screaming and sobbing, but eventually starts laughing creepily. Since Kitty often expressed open disdain for her husband, I have to wonder how strong Kitty and Josh's marriage really was. I also have to wonder if Kitty got her sense of power from proximity to power. What do I mean by that? When your identity is close to the peak of the power structure, but isn't at the very peak of the power structure, it puts you in an interesting spot. You're allowed to be somewhat lazy with your power because the peak of the power structure, rich white men, are likely going to take care of you. There is less incentive to develop your internal power, unless you start questioning the power structure. Then you might start questioning the type of power that you really want to develop. But if you don't question the power structure as a white woman, you tend to rely on proximity to power rather than building your own internal power. In other words, you may rely on rich white men to give you your sense of power. Honestly, I think that Kitty resents her husband because of how she relies on him for her power. I think she resents the idea that she has given her power away to her husband. And I'm sure that she hates that she relies on a man's validation. Kitty was literally delusional enough to ask her husband's shadow for help. This scene shows how much Kitty relies on her husband, even her husband's shadow, for safety. However, she was the second to last Tyler family member to be killed, which does speak to her internal strength. As a mother and a woman, she probably had to build the most internal power out of everybody in the Tyler family. As a mother, I'm sure she's had to do some kind of shadow work because being a mother will just automatically make you go through that, at least part of the way. It's really interesting to me that Zora is the one who kills Kitty's shadow, Dahlia. Like a 14-year-old battles a grown woman's shadow and wins. Now, I'm not saying that all 14-year-old black girls are stronger than grown white women, but I think it is a commentary on our culture that a lot of people think 14-year-old black girls are stronger than grown white women. No race is inherently stronger or weaker than another. It really depends on how you're raised and your environment and your personality and the mentality that you develop. The way I see it, a lot of young black girls are just forced to think critically about the world at younger ages than white girls, especially back in the day when racism was more prevalent and more obvious. I think this is highlighted by the fact that Addie sees her shadow self when she's 8 years old and starts questioning the world, whereas Kitty doesn't see her shadow self until she's in her 40s. It's also worth mentioning that I've never met a 60-year-old black woman who acts like a 12-year-old, but I have met 60-year-old white women who act like 12-year-olds. There is a kind of lack of self-awareness there. After Zora kills Dahlia, the Wilsons sit down at the Tylers' dinner table, and Jason asks how many are there going to be, which surprises the rest of the family. The Wilsons sit down to watch the news to see if there are any more shadow people running around, and there most definitely are, all carrying scissors and killing people on the news. Gabe is insistent on staying in the house until Addie says, "You don't get to make the decisions anymore," implying their family was a patriarchy but has now shifted to Addie taking control in this crisis. This makes a lot of sense to me because the feminine is internal while the masculine is external. Since they are battling their shadow selves, the internal realm, it makes sense that a woman would take the lead here. Following Addie's insistence, the family walks outside to the car, but they forget the car keys. Addie goes back inside the house to discover that one of the twins isn't really dead. She kills the twin in the kitchen while Jason watches, and this is where we really see Addie's anger start to come out in the movie. The way I see it, Addie killing the Tyler teenager could symbolize how Addie needs to kill her inner teenager. If Addie is frustrated with her teenage self for giving away her power, for giving up her individuality, for giving up the dance. The same way that Zora is battling between her individuality and how to fit into society, I'm sure that Addie went through that same problem. And by the way, this balance never stops. This questioning never stops as you get older. You will always have to balance your society self with your individual self. You have to be true to your shadow self, but also be respectful of the people around you. Addie grabs the car keys and she and Jason head outside. They all get into the car and Zora says that she's driving. Addie starts to argue, but she gets in the back seat when she sees Umbre in the driveway. The timing of Zora's shadow appearing further illustrates my point about Addie's inner teenager. Zora is driving and Addie still has her chains on and is sitting in the back seat. This may symbolize how Addie's inner teenager might still be in control, while Addie's adult self has taken a backseat to the situation. Her teenage self is more in control now. Her teenage self and her anger are coming out. Gabe tells Zora to back up, but Zora shifts into drive instead and speeds directly at Umbre. Typical teenage behavior, ignoring what your parents tell you to do. Zora speeds at her shadow, who climbs the car and attacks from the sunroof. Zora manages to shake her off the car, and Umbre is launched into the forest. Addie then gets out of the car to make sure Umbre is really dead and finds her stuck in a tree with serious injuries. Umbre slowly dies in front of Addie stuck in the tree, but instead of Addie finishing Umbre off and making it a quick death, Addie actually comforts Umbre. She shushes Umbre in a reassuring tone until Umbre takes her last breath. I think a big part of why Addie comforts Umbre is because it's her daughter's shadow. And watching this scene really gave me the warm fuzzies on the inside because I love seeing a mother comfort her daughter's dark side on screen. However, I have a second interpretation of what the scene could have meant, and it's a little bit darker. Addie shushing Umbre before she died could symbolize how Addie is shushing Zora's self-expression. Umbre is slowly suffocated from serious injuries and is being shushed by Addie. At first, I thought it was really sweet of Addie to shush Umbre and to comfort her in her dying, but in this context, I have to wonder if Addie encouraged Zora to suppress herself, to push down her individuality until Zora killed her own individuality. I know that's a very dark interpretation, but there's a little bit of truth in that. And it does say something about how parenting is done in America. The Wilson family drives all night until the sun comes up and they stop at a beach where they see a car on fire. They realize it's their old car and that Jason's shadow Pluto was the one who set their car on fire. Addie, who is now driving, stops the car and approaches Pluto. She seems guarded at first, holding up a fireplace poker, but then she lowers it and holds out her hand as a gesture of peace. Pluto pulls up his mask to look at Addie and then looks past her to look at Jason in the car. Jason says, "It's a trap, everybody get out." And everybody gets out of the car. Addie looks down and notices a trail of gasoline coming from the car. It's clear that Pluto had the intention of blowing them up. But before Pluto can strike his match, Jason holds his arms out in a Christ-like stance, and Pluto mimics him. Jason walks backwards and Pluto does the same. They walk backwards from each other until Pluto backs up into the already burning car and dies in that fire. There are two interesting points to me about this scene. Firstly, the Christ-like stance that Jason takes to save his family. It's like he sacrifices a part of himself to save his family. He crucifies himself. Addie held out her hand to Pluto, to Jason's shadow, as if she wanted to save him. But Jason chose to kill his own shadow. Red swooping in to take Jason was such an interesting trade. The way I see it is Red kidnapping Jason could be similar to how Addie shushed Umbre. Although Addie extended a hand physically to Pluto, her shadow self kidnapped Jason, and Jason killed his own shadow self. To say it more simply, Jason choosing to kill his own shadow gives some insight into how kids will change and suppress parts of themselves if they think that these individual traits will distress their family or their community.
Side note, I have to wonder if Pluto setting the car on fire further highlights how Jason not only triggered Addie, but also triggered the rest of the family into confronting their shadow selves. Kids usually encourage older people to question themselves. And in my experience, the younger sibling is typically the one that makes the rest of the family question themselves. Because if you're the baby of the family, typically you're allowed to be a child for a little bit longer because you're not the older sibling. So I have to wonder if Jason / Pluto having a knack for fire and for magic is the reason why the shadows came to the surface in the first place. That Jason / Pluto triggered his family into confronting themselves, into facing themselves, saying, "Why are you giving up your dreams at 14? Why are you running away from your child self? Why are you running away from your individuality? Why are you conforming to society standards?" I think the younger sibling typically triggers the rest of the family into doing this deep dive of self-awareness.
After Red kidnaps Jason, Addie has a hunch that Jason was taken to the Merlin Funhouse where she first saw Red as a child. Addie goes deeper into the building than she ever has before, and past the Hall of Mirrors, there is an escalator that goes down into the abandoned tunnels where the shadows, the tethered, live. It's also worth mentioning that when she passes the fake forest part, she smashes the owl that pops out at her with her fire poker. And remember, the owl is a symbol of wisdom. Addie smashes a symbol of wisdom in her search for Red and Jason. This could symbolize that in her assimilating to adult culture in the US, she had to smash a kind of wisdom that most children are born with. She then walks into an abandoned classroom where Red is carving a line of stick figures, holding hands onto a chalkboard. If you look at the floor of the classroom Addie enters, you see that the rabbits that were previously in cages are now hopping freely around the floor, symbolizing that this rebirth has escaped. The tethered have escaped. The shadows have escaped. Well, the shadow people are called the tethered because they are tethered to the humans they look like. Red goes on to say that the tethered were created by humans, but the humans were unable to create human puppets, which was their goal, so the humans abandoned the tethered. With no direction, the tethered went crazy. Now, this part made me think about how children often relate to their parents in US society. A lot of parents expect their kids to be carbon copies of them, or they see their kids as these cute dolls or puppets. not realizing that their kids are born with their own souls and personalities. Kids are often encouraged to follow a status quo, which can be really fucked up sometimes because it has been proven that societies that have the highest rates of conformity also have the highest mental illness rates. Nations with the most conformity also have the highest suicide rates. Like Red said, humans learned how to copy the body, but not the soul. Kids are often encouraged to be successful, but a kid's definition of success is very different from a parent's definition of success. Also, a kid's definition of empowering is different from a parent's definition of empowering. Everybody is always trying to measure their power against one person's power. That one person's power is always going to win until you can reclaim your own type of power. Does that make sense? Again, I digress. Red says that Addie and Red were brought together by God that night when they were children. Red also says, I wish you had taken me with you to Addie. She wanted to be a part of Addie's life. Years later, when Addie became a dancer, Red says it was a miracle, that she saw God and God showed her her path. She says that she knows Addie felt it too. The year they both started dancing, Red says the tethered treated her differently. There was a sense that Red would deliver the tethered from their misery. She found her faith through dance. She found a spirit through dance. This part reminds me of how creativity and art can empower people to connect with their shadow selves. How art can be a way to develop internal power and self-awareness. This internal power that radiates from Red's dancing is likely what makes the other tethereds see Red as their spiritual leader. Not only is Red the only one who dances, Red is the only one who shows a kind of self-expression in the tethered realm. She has a kind of life to her that makes her different from the other tethereds. Red goes on to mention that she started planning her attack on the above world. Not only did she want to attack Addie and kill Addie, but she wanted to start a revolution. As Red is explaining her thought process to Addie, there are shots of a t-shirt that says Hands Across America on it. It becomes clear that Red is not only the leader of the tethered, but she's also the one who came up with the idea for the Hands Across America thing. I will get back to that because that part is fascinating to me. Red goes on to say, and to think, if it weren't for you, I never would have danced at all. As she says this, she holds up a paper cutout of two people holding hands, and she pulls them apart from each other. She then walks backwards towards Addie. Addie and Red start circling each other, and as they circle each other, there are clips of both Addie and Red dancing when they're 14. It's funny how this is a pun. They're dancing around each other in the classroom, but also literally dancing in their minds. Addie and Red start to fight, and they're fighting in a classroom. Addie is literally fighting with the information she just received from Red, fighting with the information she just received from her shadow self. With the rabbits that are still hopping around the floor of the classroom, I have to take this scene as Addie going through a rebirth as she grapples with this new information. Red eventually pins Addie to a desk and whispers something to her that we can't hear, and Addie proceeds to get her ass kicked until Red decides to walk away. Addie gets up, and her memories of her dancing on stage seem to empower her and give her strength to keep fighting Red out in the hallway. Addie is riled up and energetic, but she's clumsy, while Red is smooth and precise in her movements. This contrast in Addie's clumsiness versus Red's precision reminds me of how she was specifically a ballet dancer that valued precision. In this sense, Addie is fighting with the idea that she has to be precise all the time.
This part also reminds me of something I heard from a dance instructor. They said in order to be extremely precise and beautiful in your dance movements, you have to be clumsy first. You have to be clumsy and allow yourself to expand before you can make everything precise. If you try to make things precise first, you're not going to expand as much as you need to. That's why kids are clumsy and expand before they learn how to walk and how to run. You need to be clumsy and expand and then smoothen everything out later. That's the natural process of things.
Red continues to kick Addie's butt, but then she walks away again. Addie follows her into another room. This room is full of bunk beds. This is where Addie finally stabs Red. And when I saw this part, I thought about how when you're asleep, your subconscious and your unconscious speak to your conscious mind through your dreams. And if red is a symbol for Addie's unconscious mind, I have to wonder if Addie killing red in a space meant for dreams is a symbol of Addie killing her own dreams. The timing of this death is also important. Addie kills Red after hearing the message from Red. Addie kills her unconscious after hearing this message from her unconscious. It takes Red a while to die, so she whistles at Addie. And we see a close-up of Addie's face as she starts to whistle back at Red. Addie is mimicking her shadow. It reminds me of how Jason and Pluto mimicked each other. But instead of the shadow copying Addie, Addie is copying her shadow. Addie looks terrified by this, and she snaps Red's neck, finally killing her. She goes into a kind of primal rage in how she kills Red, and then she starts chuckling. She seems changed by this interaction, darker and creepier, almost like she's taken on a piece of her shadow that she just killed. I also think that it is symbolic that Addie snaps Red's neck. If you don't have a neck, you don't have a throat, and you don't have a voice. You can't speak. And Addie didn't want her subconscious to speak to her, let alone whistle to her or sing to her. Addie keeps walking and finds Jason curled up in a locker. She's still in her creepy mode at first, but this fades and she seems to become more like herself when she hugs her son. She says, "They can't hurt you anymore. Do you understand?" And Jason basically says no, he doesn't understand, which is kind of the whole point of the movie to me.
We are never truly done battling our shadows, but we have tools to talk to our shadows or dance with our shadows or communicate with our shadows, which is why throughout this video I say that shadow work is very important, because if you're not aware of your shadow, you will get blindsided by it, which is when you are not safe from your shadow. You need to dance with your shadow to understand how she moves. You need to create with your shadow to understand how she thinks or how he thinks. The reason why Jason was able to kill his own shadow so easily is because he integrated his shadow into him. He played with his shadow. He understood how his shadow worked. And Adelaide drew strength by dancing with her shadow or thinking about fighting with her shadow as a dance. It wasn't a fight, it was a dance. And I think that applies to most creative art forms, writing, dancing, any kind of creative expression. Talking even is a type of creative expression. I heard that Beyonce does video diaries where she just records herself talking to her phone camera, and that's another way she gets to know herself outside of her music, which I think is really cool.
We all have monsters inside of ourselves that we are constantly battling. And when we kill a part of our shadow self, we integrate that shadow into us, which isn't a bad thing. Everything is healthier when it is a part of the whole. When we see this big twist at the end where it's revealed that Addie was originally a shadow, it reminded me of something I posted on my Instagram story a few days ago, where I was talking about how I think that homes that are too quiet are toxic because you don't allow your kids to have this kind of self-expression. Having too much silence in a home doesn't encourage a kid to find out who they are internally. The psychologist in Addie's flashback encouraged Addie to draw, to dance, to write, to do something that would tell her parents who she is and what she's thinking and what she's going through. Psychologists know that kids really do need a type of self-expression. It seems like Addie didn't think that she could talk to her parents. Addie didn't want to make too much noise or take up too much space. So she had to learn how to use her inner voice in other ways besides speaking. In this context, it makes the part where Jason pulls his monster mask down over his face the scariest part in the entire movie. Because Addie is encouraging Jason to be quiet, to don his monster mask, to not show his true face. Addie smiles during this part, and that's her version of a mask, while Jason dons his monster mask. In this sense, they are both wearing masks, and they had this kind of agreement to not talk about their shadows. Jason doesn't seem to like this very much, which is why a kernel of distrust is put into their relationship. Jason probably sees this ignoring of the shadows as inhumane, even monstrous, which is why he dons his monster mask while Addie dons a smile. Jason wants Addie to acknowledge that she is a shadow. Jason wants Addie to tell the truth, but Addie would rather smile and be polite and don a mask. I want to end this video by saying that individuality is so important, and I can't stress that enough. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned it several times throughout this video, and that our shadow selves are really just the parts of ourselves that we don't want to see and we don't want to acknowledge, whether that's because we don't want to disrupt our community or because we're scared of those parts of ourselves, or both. This very last shot of the movie reminds me of a common theme in spiritualities and especially indigenous cultures all around the world. In many of these cultures, they believe in the concept of oneness, that when you die, your spirit goes back to oneness, back to source, back to unity. However, these shadow selves didn't join the line until they killed their physical self. Another way you could say it is these shadows didn't stand in unity until they killed their materialistic selves.
I didn't intend on making this a persuasive essay. I more so wanted this to be a conversation, so you can believe whatever you want or take away whatever you want. I would love to hear you guys' thoughts. If you want to leave a comment down below, I would love to keep this conversation going, because this movie is not just about individuals' shadow work, but also how we can do shadow work within family dynamics, or we can heal generational traumas and rewire our brains and change our culture, because we can change our culture whenever we want by just changing how we think and encouraging the people around us to change how they think. A lot of people like to think that they don't want to argue about culture, they don't want to talk politics or religion, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's really important to have these honest conversations. I think that honesty has to be balanced with social graces. But I do think that honesty and having honest conversations with the people around you that you love is a sign of respect. So I just wanted to end the video on that note. Again, comment below. I love hearing other people's opinions on these topics, and I hope to see you guys in another video.
Go drink your